Hello class, welcome to Public Law, Session 6, and today's topic will be on the royal prerogative, or also known as prerogative powers. All right, so we will start the session by first of all me telling you the question that we will be doing, which is the 2019, not the June paper, not the May paper, I beg your pardon, so not Zone A or Zone B, but the October paper, all right, the October paper, because I didn't actually see a prerogative powers question in the May paper. So we'll look at the October paper, and that would be 2019 October question 6. You will find this in the notes that I uploaded a couple of days ago, titled Prerogative Powers, and this set of notes will have 13 pages, okay, and there are a couple of questions in here, so I will be uploading 2 videos on prerogative powers. So when I finished this, then I will upload another question on reform of prerogative powers in my next one. All right. Okay, so for today we're going to be looking at the 2019 question. Please look at page 1 of the handout. Yeah. Now, what does the question ask? It says, discuss the legal and political controls, okay, the legal and political controls over ministers' exercise of royal prerogative, executive powers of state. Now, this is a typical area which is asked by the examiners, namely about how prerogative powers are actually controlled. Yeah, and the relevant prerogative powers will be the ones which are exercised by ministers, because they are the ones who are running the day-to-day functionings of government. Yeah, so the question is asking, what are the legal controls and what are the political controls, okay, and asking us to discuss these and to look at the adequacy of that control. So I have divided my answer into several parts, where it says general remarks, law cases, reports and other references, and what a good answer to this question would look at. I'll leave you to look at that for yourself, because that is an extract from the University of London examiner's report, which I've put there for your ease of reference. Okay, so I will go straight to the suggested approach halfway down page 1. So first I will look at what are prerogative powers, and when I say under 1 what are prerogative powers, I will at this point respond to the question here as well. I'm just writing a reminder to myself to address that with you when we come back to this in a minute. So number 1, what are prerogative powers? And if you turn the page, number 2, why do we need them today? The role, the justification for prerogative powers today. Number 3, the scope of prerogative powers, and then go straight to the issue of control. Why do we need to control it? The link between controlling prerogative powers and the rule of law. And then you can either start with legal control, or you can start with political control. So the question asks legal control and political control. Yeah, so it's up to you to decide which one that you want to start with. So I'm starting off looking at political control. Political control essentially means parliamentary control. So how does Parliament help to control prerogative powers? So that's number 4, political control. And then if you turn to page 3, number 5, once I'm done with the political control, then I go on to the judicial control. For judicial control, I will break my answer up into 3 parts: the pre-GCHQ era, GCHQ itself, post-GCHQ, and in a way now we have a 4th era. Now, what do I mean by the 4th era? The Miller era. Miller number 1, Miller number 2. What do they tell us? So in a sense, I'm looking at Miller as almost a 4th era in the sense of the judicial activism that we see in these cases. So having looked at judicial control, number 6, I also look at where the judiciary may not control the exercise of prerogative powers. And often we see this happening where there is an issue of separation of powers being involved. If the subject matter is not justiciable, if it is a political issue, the courts may not want to get involved. So they exercise what we call judicial deference, non-involvement. So I've put that under number 6, judicial deference and separation of powers. And then number 7, I look at some recent developments. And number 8, I look at the Supreme Court decisions, the 2 Miller decisions, what I call the 4th era, so to speak. And then after that, number 9, I come to the conclusion as to what I can say about these 2 types of control. All right, and it's a good idea as well at some point, and I'll do this in my conclusion, to suggest whether or not there ought to be any reforms here in order to better control prerogative powers in the future. All right, so that is an outline. Let's now go back to page 1. So under suggested approach, please. So number 1, where I've put what are prerogative powers, respond to the question here, and you can start off by just saying that the question requires me to discuss the legal and political controls over ministers' exercise of prerogative executive powers, and this answer will argue that these controls have been improved today as compared to a century ago, but there is still room for further improvement and reform to be made. All right. This answer will also argue that the recent Miller decisions illustrate a commendable approach by the Supreme Court to be able to come out and address the issue in a courageous manner, to basically tell, to put controls over the Prime Minister's use of prerogative powers. And in doing so, the Supreme Court is acting as a checks and balance, as a kind of guardian in a sense of the Constitution, and controlling those prerogative powers so that the PM doesn't think they can, he or she, in Miller number 1, it was Theresa May, that she could do whatever she wanted, just going and invoking Article 50, all right, which would have ended up repealing the ECA, and Boris Johnson in Miller number 2, proroguing Parliament whenever he felt like it. So in other words, what the Supreme Court is also telling us, behind the scene, is that just because you're the Prime Minister doesn't mean that you can go and use your prerogative powers to your convenience, to the detriment of democratic principles and the rest of the nation. So that's very important. So judicial control in these 2 cases has been considerable, yeah, and we'll come to that when we discuss the Miller decisions. So once you've responded, you need to, bottom of page 1, discuss the sources of the Crown's executive power. So you might have started off by talking about how at the beginning prerogative powers emanated from an absolute monarch at that time, simply because that was the way things were. The king or the queen was the apex of the system, and what they said or did simply could not be challenged. There was the legal maxim that the king could do no wrong. But today we no longer live in an absolute monarchy. We live in a parliamentary democracy. So therefore, we no longer need to abide by these somewhat archaic definitions at the bottom of page 1. For example, Dicey and Blackstone referred to prerogative powers as the residue of arbitrary or discretionary power that the king had. These powers never came from an act of parliament. They were from common law. So these powers evolved, and if you turn to page 2, we now have 3 categories. The 2004 report of the House of Commons PAC categorized prerogative powers into 3 categories: the Queen's constitutional prerogatives 1, the Crown's legal prerogatives number 2, and number 3, prerogative executive powers. This question is about the 3rd category. I repeat, so this question is about the 3rd category. That means prerogative executive powers. So the question is asking us about that. That means prerogative powers exercised by ministers. Number 2, the next stage of your answer, all right? So why do we need ministers exercising prerogative powers? The answer is simple. Because today, ministers are given their powers. That means they are ministers of the crown, of the queen. So they are basically exercising these powers as part of the machinery of government in order to give flexibility to how they run the government. So prerogative powers are necessary to lubricate the machinery of government. Okay, whether domestically or abroad, they are still necessary today. However, if you look at the third part of your answer, there's a need to control the scope of prerogative powers. And I've put a question there. Whenever you see Q, that means question. Why do we need to control prerogative powers? What is the link between this topic and the rule of law? Now, what are the answers to those questions? Why do we need to control prerogative powers? The answer is very simple. It's in order to avoid abuse of power. It's so that there is clarity as to how these powers are exercised. So if we cannot control power, if it is not subject to judicial review, then this would be a violation of the rule of law principle. Yeah? So we need to control prerogative powers for those reasons. So number 4, we come to the different types of control. Let's start with political control. Now, so what do we mean by political control? There are 2 ways of political control. I've put at the bottom of page 2, parliamentary methods, all right, of scrutiny and control. So how does Parliament control prerogative powers? There are 2 ways. The first way, number 1, is through statute. Now, when I say control through statute, in a sense, this is a political method, it's a parliamentary method, it's also a legal method, isn't it? Because when you have a statute, that's law, isn't it? It's a legal method. So why have I put it under political control? Because it's Parliament that comes out with the statute. So Parliament can actually enact a legislation, enact a statute to either take away that prerogative power, to amend it in some way, to restrict it in some way, or even to abolish it altogether. Let's look at some examples where Parliament came up with these statutes. On your page 3, the first case that you have is the case of AG against De Keyser's Hotel. Now, AG and De Keyser's Hotel was about payment of compensation for damages done in a hotel. So there could be 2 ways in which the government could pay for these damages. One way was through prerogative powers. Another way was through statute, the Defence of the Realm Act. So therefore, if it was you and you had 2 choices, choice A, to pay a certain amount, let's say this amount, for compensation, and choice B, that you had to pay this amount for compensation, which one would you choose? You'd choose the lesser amount, right? It's cheaper for you to pay this compared to this. So if this is the common law prerogative power, you're going to use this. You're going to want to use this as your power, which is what the government wanted to do. Now, the House of Lords said, no, you can't use your common law prerogative power because statute is higher. So the Defence of the Realm Act is higher. So if you look at page 1, if you look at what Lord Dunedin in the House of Lords said in paragraph 2, he said, it is certain that if the whole ground of something which could be done by the prerogative is covered by statute, it is the statute that rules. So the prerogative power goes into abeyance. You can't rely on it. So this case is a good example of control by statute of the prerogative power to pay compensation. In that sense, this case is very similar to a later case in 1990. De Keyser's was in 1920. And several decades later, in 1995, there was the case of Ex parte Fire Brigades Union. Now, Ex parte Fire Brigades Union was also about payment of compensation. And in Ex parte Fire Brigades Union also, the Home Secretary had this issue. Common law, paying this amount of criminal injuries compensation. statute paying a much higher amount under the Criminal Justice Act. So which would I be wanting to pay? Of course, I want to pay the lesser amount. House of Lords says, no, you can't, because you've got the Criminal Injuries Act of 1988. You've got to follow that. This controls the prerogative power. So statute in the in this case, the Fire Brigades Union case, won. So there is a similarity with De Keyser's Hotel, that case, and the Fire Brigades case, because in both these cases, the statutes succeed in controlling the prerogative power. So sometimes statutes can control the prerogative power well. These are examples of that. However, this must be balanced with a very important case which shows that sometimes, even if you have a statute, it may not take away the prerogative power. Which case am I talking about? Can anyone tell me? Well, obviously you can't, because I'm stuck in this video and you are stuck in your house. So I'm going to have to do what I always do. What is that? Ask the question, I've got to answer it myself. Yep. Okay, so what was the case? The case was Northumbria Police Authority. Remember that class? Northumbria Police Authority. So in Northumbria Police Authority, there was the prerogative power of the police to keep the Queen's peace. There was also the Police Act. So common law prerogative power, keep the Queen's peace. Police Act to also ensure that the police could do whatever they wanted in order to prevent riots, to maintain peace. Now, you think about it if you're the policeman. So you've got one stick here. Let me look for another stick. And you've got another stick here. Oh, look. Oh, it's a Spider-Man ruler. So you've got the Police Act, powerful Spider-Man here. You've also got the prerogative power, all right, here. And you're thinking, why should you give up one? If you give up one, you've only left with one stick. Why don't you, shouldn't you be able to rely on both? After all, it's about maintaining peace. And the Court of Appeal agrees with that. The Court of Appeal say, yep, you can actually have both at the same time, the prerogative power and the statute. Now, what does that mean? What does that mean? This might look bigger and stronger, but I can use both at the same time. So if you look at the question that I've, two questions that I've posed there, what do these cases tell you about the relationship between prerogative powers and statute? What do they tell you? Now, what they tell me is that it's not so clear-cut. So Lord Dunedin said that in AG and De Keyser's, he said that if it refers to the whole ground, then maybe you can say that the statute will prevail. But if it's a bit unclear, like in the Northumbria case, then you could have both. So this shows that control by statute is not always clear, is not always certain. And furthermore, there are so many examples of prerogative powers that don't even have a statute to control their functioning. They're just simply based on common law. So therefore, my conclusion here is that control by statute is not a guarantee and is not that effective at the end of the day. Now, number two, are there other ways of political control besides statutes? The answer is yes. There are parliamentary methods. For example, in Parliament itself, question time, parliamentary select committees, opposition asking you questions, backbenchers asking you questions on your use of prerogative powers. But these kind of question and answer sessions may not be that effective because the government, by convention, very often will say that, look, we're not going to answer these questions because by convention, especially if it concerns something that's very political or concerns national security, we're not going to answer those questions. So this kind of parliamentary scrutiny may not be adequate. All right. So once you've said this, you're done with political control. And our conclusion is political control is there, it's important, but it's intra-regulatory mechanism. That means that It's Parliament controlling itself, right? It's ministers, controlling themselves. It's not a neutral body. It's not an outside body. It's not another agency controlling them. So it will always be limited, this kind of control. Okay? Now, next. So once we've finished with political control, we come to judicial control. Now, judicial control means control by the courts. All right? And you might want to say that it's very important that the courts are there in order to control prerogative powers, because I just said just now, because the courts are the independent body. Ministers are the ones who are using the powers. They're not very likely to control themselves well. But the courts are an independent body. So it's crucial for the courts to be able to play their role to checks and balance, to act as a checks and balance mechanism over ministers' exercise of prerogative powers. All right? And for many years now, in fact, even if we go as way back as the 17th century, in cases like Darnell's case, in cases like proclamations at the bottom of page 3, the courts are looking at prerogative powers. But their scrutiny, in a sense, was controlled. It was limited because the only thing that they were looking at, if you look at the bottom of page 3, the courts limited their role to questioning only two things: the existence and the extent, the scope of the power. That's what they were looking at. Does this power exist? What's the scope of it? Right? They were not so keen, I beg your pardon, to question the exercise of the power itself, whether it was right or wrong. Also because of the fear of the legal maxim that the king could do no wrong. All right? Because in those years it was an absolute monarchy. I mean, think of yourself being a judge during Henry VIII's time, and if you had said that, he had done something wrong or misused his prerogative powers, he could have just said, off with your head, and off you would have gone to the Tower of London with your head to be chopped off, isn't it? So there was a bit of a reluctance for some time. Yeah? Okay? Now, by the time we come to the 20th century, there's more of an openness, and if you look at page 4, in the case of BBC and Johns in 1965, the court said, Lord Diplock said, no new prerogative powers could be created. All right? So you can't just simply create a new prerogative powers. In GCHQ, in 1985, this was a landmark decision because for the first time, the House of Lords said that the Prime Minister had exercised, this was Mrs. Thatcher, she had exercised a prerogative power from an order in council in 1982, and that prerogative power, what did it do? She used that prerogative power to withdraw the rights of the employees in GCHQ to belong to a trade union. So she took away their right to belong to a trade union without prior consultation. So they brought a case. They won in the High Court, all right? They won the case in the High Court. But then the government appealed to the Court of Appeal and then the House of Lords. And the House of Lords looked at this, and the House of Lords said, look, for years, where the prerogative power comes from, that means the source, S-O-U-R-C-E, the source of the prerogative power for a long time determined its reviewability. But we're going to change that now. So the source of a prerogative power will no longer determine its reviewability. We will review it. What's more important, all right, is the subject matter. We will review it as long as it is a justiciable matter. The problem here, they said, was Mrs. Thatcher said that she did this because of national security reasons. And national security is something which is non-justiciable. So in 1985, when the House of Lords said this, the result was that the appellants lost their case, all right, because of national security. But yet we call it a victory for the rule of law, because for the first time, as far as control of prerogative powers is concerned, the House of Lords is saying, look, we are going to control how the Prime Minister exercises this prerogative power, which is regulation of the civil service. It's something very important. But here, the only reason why we're not doing it is because of national security. So in that sense, the GCHQ case is very important, because from the aspect of control, judicial control, which is what the question is asking, it's the first House of Lords decision that's basically saying, look, it is no longer the source of the power that's important, it's a subject matter. We will grant review if we feel it's justiciable. Okay, so that's very important. And then I've put a question halfway down your page 4. Question: what do these cases tell you about the relationship between prerogative powers and the courts? My answer to that is that it tells us that as far as control is concerned, the courts are more willing now after GCHQ to control prerogative powers, as long as the subject matter is justiciable. So justiciability is key. All right. Now, after this, what happened? If you look at some other examples here where the courts have reviewed the exercise of the prerogative power, for example, the granting of passports in the case of Ex parte Everett, the prerogative of mercy in Ex parte Bentley, the repatriation of islanders in the Banku case, and you have a discussion of Banku at the bottom of page 4. Banku is a problematic case because in the first decision, in Banku number 1, the courts came to the conclusion that the forcible removal of the islanders was unlawful, that the Home Secretary had exercised the prerogative power under the immigration ordinance in an unlawful manner, bringing these people out of their homeland. It ordered for compensation to be paid to these people. So that means that in the first decision, it was saying that the exercise of the prerogative power, all right, was justiciable. But in Banku number 2, the issue was about, okay, had the government gave a promise to these islanders, had the government gave them a legitimate expectation for them to be repatriated back. Now, here the House of Lords said there was no legitimate expectation, and the government won in Banku number 2. So whilst Banku number 1 in a sense is a triumph for the rule of law for the islanders, but Banku number 2, as far as repatriation is concerned, that means sending them back to the Chagos Islands, the House of Lords is showing deference to the executive. The House of Lords is saying, look, we don't know whether that political promise was made to send them back. This is something that the executive has to decide on. We can't decide on. So you see, that shows us, very nicely that the courts will go some way to saying that something is justiciable. But then they may not go all the way if they feel that if it is something that is very political, like repatriation of the islanders, where the House of Lords eventually said that it's something that, they didn't want to get involved in, that they must defer to the better judgment of the executive. Which brings us to page number 5 and heading number 6, judicial deference. Deference and SOP, Crown and Jones, if there's deployment of armed forces. The court will say, look, we're not going to touch that. That's a non-justiciable issue. The case of Crown Abasi, something concerning foreign policy where the army goes, is a no-no. They're not going to get involved. Recent judicial developments. For example, look at the second case there. The power to refuse to issue or to cancel a passport in XH against Secretary of State. Now, just now in Everett, we were told that the power to refuse a passport is justiciable, correct enough? So we know it's justiciable. But what's interesting about the XH case is what the judicial decision is saying, that if the Home Secretary decides that a particular person is not going to be given his passport for national security reasons, and here because he was purportedly involved in terrorist activities, the court's not going to get involved with that. So whenever we see national security or terrorism-related issues, the issue seems to become non-justiciable for separation of powers reasons. So how far will the courts actually go? All right, we see another area where the courts are not that keen to get involved. And if you look at the bottom of page 5, look at the third bullet point there, the case of Muhammad against Ministry of Defense, where the claimant was an Afghan national captured by British troops. And he alleged that he was ill-treated by the British troops. But the British government said this is an quote-unquote an act of state. An act of state is a prerogative power. What did the court say about that? If something is classified as an act of state, they won't get involved. It's non-justiciable. So an act of state is unclear to me, because what exactly is an act of state? There's no clear definition. Why is this important? If there is no clear definition, then if the courts, if the executive says this is an act of state, please don't get involved with it, it puts pressure on the court, because it's basically a message by the government saying this is what our army is doing, this is what our armed forces troops are doing, just bug off here. And the courts may have to submit to judicial deference. So if something at the moment in law, if something is classified as an act of state, it's non-justiciable. There's no judicial control. Okay? Now, and then we come to the last part of answer, and I'm discussing it in the last part of my answer, but of course, you could have gone to Miller much earlier. Miller is a very, very important, well, the two Miller decisions are very important. Now, so we come to the Supreme Court Miller decisions, and both these decisions should be there and should feature an important part of your answer. Now, Miller number 1 was in 2017. Miller number 1 was about the Prime Minister's prerogative power to invoke Article 50 of the EU Treaty. This is the prerogative power of foreign relations. Now, a majority in the Supreme Court, 8 out of 11, said that she could not use her prerogative power to do this. Why? Because if you look at page 6, yes, Lord Neuberger for the majority at paragraph 81 said that what? If there was a major change, I've put it in bold here, to UK constitutional arrangements, this must be effected in the only way that the UK Constitution recognizes, which is by parliamentary legislation. That means an act of parliament. All right? That means an act of parliament. So 8 out of 11 said that we must control this prerogative power. It should not be exercised this way because it's an attack on Parliament's supremacy in that sense. However, please note the 3 dissenting judgments. For example, Lord Reid, what is he saying? He is saying that no, the prerogative power does give scope for the PM to do this. So this tells us that the prerogative power of foreign relations is also unclear, because though 8 people said that she can't exercise this power and they were willing to control it, 3 of the judges are saying that she has that power. Therefore, there is a lack of clarity with it. So I would suggest that some of these prerogative powers, like for example foreign relations, like for example the next Miller case, prorogation of Parliament, I would suggest perhaps they should be codified. The PM's prerogative powers should be codified in order for that to be more certainty and clarity in the future. All right? So this is a reform that I would put forward in my ending, in my conclusion. So at the bottom of page 6, I've asked the question, what does Miller tell us about judicial control of prerogative powers? What's the majority decision? That they're willing to control the PM's exercise of prerogative powers. What's a justiciable matter? Depends on the court. And we see this perfectly in Miller number 2, which is on your page 7. So in Miller number 2, what was the issue? The issue was about Prime Minister Boris Johnson's use of prerogative power to prorogue Parliament. And here we have a unanimous judgment. All 11 of the justices said He can't do this. It was an unlawful exercise of prerogative power. They were willing to control it. And in fact, Lady Hale said, judges have always controlled prerogative powers. If you look there, yes, at paragraph 3 on your page 7, the court ruled first that the issue was justiciable. The courts had been protecting parliamentary sovereignty by restricting the prerogative for centuries. Look at the cases that she refers to: proclamations, Antique and Carrington, AG and De Kaiser's Hotel, Burma Oil, Fire Brigades Union. So she's saying the courts have always controlled prerogative powers from the 16th century, right? And then she goes on to say 2 fundamental principles underpin the Constitution: parliamentary sovereignty and parliamentary accountability. And Lady Hale, what did she say? If Parliament was prorogued, then it's an attack on Parliament sovereignty. It's an attack on parliamentary accountability. There's a limit to the power to prorogue Parliament. There's a legal limit. You cannot exercise it without reasonable justification. So how does the Supreme Court control the prerogative power here? The control is by asking the question whether there is a reasonable justification. That's the control. Whether there is a reasonable justification for proroguing Parliament. The answer was, there's no reasonable justification. Therefore, it's unlawful. So, what do we learn from Miller number 2? I've asked that question, and my answer would be a judicial willingness by the Supreme Court. Yeah, a judicial willingness by the Supreme Court to control the exercise of the Prime Minister's prerogative power to prorogue Parliament. Okay, so a judicial willingness to control the exercise of the Prime Minister's prerogative power to prorogue Parliament. My second question, in your view, is the Supreme Court showing this willingness? Yeah. I just said yes to that. Question 3, do you agree with Lady Hale that this is a justiciable matter? Should it be? I would say yes, definitely, because it has urgent ramifications on the Constitution itself. And if it had not been challenged, you're going to let the Prime Minister do whatever he wants. All right? The Prime Minister is not God. Yeah? Well, even God sometimes doesn't do whatever he wants or she wants, isn't it? Right? So why does Lady Hale say that it's a one-off case? Why? Have a think about that. Why? Now, to me, she says that because deep down, all right, deep down, Lady Hale also knows that it is a political matter. But she's saying that it's so urgent here because this was decided in September. At the end of October, they were supposed to exit. So she says that, we've got to do something here. It shows that it's an extraordinary decision because it shows the willingness of the Supreme Court to step in to control prerogative powers where they really need to. So conclusion, yes, what are the 2 different types of control? We've looked at political and legal controls. My conclusion would be that the legal controls are certainly more thorough, more extensive, all right, compared to the political controls. And certainly I will come to the conclusion that the 2 Miller decisions add a very interesting dimension to judicial control of prerogative powers because it shows a willingness by the Supreme Court to step in to control the Prime Minister's use of prerogative powers, even perhaps where the subject matter may be very political, yet it has been deemed to be justiciable in both these cases. That surely is remarkable. All right? And I will leave you to think about that. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your attention. And I will go on to look at another prerogative question in the next video. Thank you. Bye-bye.